Hello BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. This week I've been working on three different books. The Linguistic Wars by Randy Allen Harris, The Courts of Chaos, part of the Chronicles of Amber series by Roger Zelazny, and The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. I actually finished these two books, The Courts of Chaos and The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, both this week. I was so close to getting them done that it was just a matter of pages this week anyways. But I'm going to keep them on my desk, keep carrying them around with me and going through them until I get around to finally finishing off my reviews of them, which, who knows, might be coming this week or next week. So I've started rereading The Courts of Chaos, just a few pages at the moment, and will maybe reread parts of it while I work on my review. So, yeah, let's talk about The Courts of Chaos, actually. I don't really have that much to say about this book, so we'll do it first and get it out of the way. All the action that happened in the pages I read this week, and it was just really the last few pages, was just the wrapping up type stuff. The bad guys had already been defeated in the pages I read previous. Yeah, there seems to be some setting up for future stories, but unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to stop here because I'm living out here in Vietnam, and it's difficult to find English books. This book I just happened to randomly stumble across when I was in a used book table on the book street here in Saigon. But I don't think my luck will hold out. In fact, I don't even think Fantasy Masterworks publishes a second volume. I mean, I'm sure those books are out there, but maybe I'd have to track them down individually. I don't think there's a Fantasy Masterworks about the second Chronicles of Amber series. So yeah, until I get access to the books, I'm just going to have to stop here. And who knows whether I'll ever pick up this series again. So watch out for a review of this coming up on this channel, either this week or next week, hopefully not longer than that. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood I also finished up. So the chapters I read this week, the last few chapters, were King Richard coming to Sherwood Forest. Now, Wikipedia says that this book, the author was never really concerned about historical accuracy. So maybe you can't take these things too seriously, but I thought it was a little bit odd that the previous king who had shown up in here was King Henry. Of course, Richard the Lionheart was the son of King Henry II, but that doesn't say anything, mention any transition or anything like that. It's just King Richard is on the throne now. Oh, by the way, and I should mention this. I mention this every week, but just in case anyone's new here. This book is an 1883 book that, according to Wikipedia at least, was famous for being one of the first books to put the popular old ballads into a novel form. So it's based off of the original ballads, although the author is taking a lot of liberties with these to make it more palatable to 19th century children. So King Richard is king now, and he comes out to Sherwood Forest, and it turns out that Robin and all his men really love King Richard for reasons that are not entirely clear. I mean, I guess it's implied that King Richard is a really good guy and wants to help all the people of England, or the other thing they say a lot is they say we love the king, we just hate all the the wicked government bureaucrats that are out here in Nottingham and Sherwood making our lives miserable. In other words, that old royalist ideology of, oh, the king is all right, we love the king. The king would never do anything against the interest of his people. It's just all these other bureaucrats that are getting in the king's way, which I think has been a populist royalist ideology through the ages, and which this Robin Hood book is arguably infused with, except for Prince John. They really don't like Prince John. So King Richard is coming through, and he wants to meet Robin Hood because he's an admirer of Robin Hood and has heard so many good things about him. Sheriff of Nottingham, of course, wants nothing to do with helping him to meet Robin Hood, but King Richard hears that if he disguises himself as a wealthy traveler, specifically a wealthy churchman traveling through Sherwood Forest, that he would be sure to meet Robin Hood. So he does, and sure enough, he meets Robin Hood. And Robin Hood in this book is portrayed as robbing the rich, but robbing the rich in a very nice way. He's always extremely courteous. He takes them into Sherwood Forest and feasts with them first. Sorry, I'm going to move this camera. I think it maybe is too high. Try that angle. Takes them into Sherwood Forest and feasts them first. Is always a charming host, even to people he really hates. So even though Robin Hood doesn't know this is the real King Richard, he's acting like a very good host and entertaining him and charming him. And then they find out it's King Richard, and all of King Robin Hood's men say, "Oh, King Richard, we love you so much, we'll do anything for you." They actually had said some of these beforehand, so it wasn't a total surprise. King Richard knew they were loyal. And then King Richard takes them back to his court, where they serve him and go on many different adventures with him, but also start to get bored and miss Sherwood Forest. And then King Richard dies in one of his adventures abroad, and Prince John comes onto the throne. And Prince John does really not like Robin Hood. There's an antagonism against them for some reason. What was it? Robin Hood didn't support him to become king or something. Anyways, Prince John really doesn't like Robin Hood. Robin Hood asks permission to go back to Sherwood Forest just to visit it when he gets homesick. Prince John tells him you can only go over there for 3 days. But then Robin goes back to Sherwood Forest and just meets up with his old band again and falls in love with it and goes back to his outlaw life. And this is where things get a little bit... The tone of this book shifts abruptly, and it's rather weird. It's in the epilogue, which is just the last few pages of this book, right? So this is the book, and then this is the epilogue here, 319, 320, 321, just the last few pages. Prince John, up until this point, has not been in the book at all, which, surprised me a little bit, because in a lot of the Hollywood versions of this story, Prince John is Robin Hood's principal antagonist. But in this book, Prince John is almost entirely out of the picture until the very end. But then, once Robin Hood goes back to his outlaw ways, and he's a lot older now than he used to be, and he's maybe in past his prime, but Prince John is determined to hunt Robin out and punish him. Now, this is something that the previous kings and the previous sheriffs and everybody else had never bothered to do. Everybody else had thought that once Robin was in Sherwood Forest, there was no getting at him. The forest was his kingdom. Robin Hood and his men knew every tree. They could just hide so easily you'd never find them. But Prince John really wants to get Robin Hood. So Prince John gets this knight called William Dale. It says here, as gallant a soldier as ever darned harness. Sir William Dale was well acquainted with Sherwood Forest, for he was head keeper over that part of it that lay nigh to good Mansfield town. Okay, so I guess that explains why they're able to try and get Robin on his home turf here. But looks like the King John's men, led by Sir William Dale, fight several bloody battles with Robin Hood in the forest. Yeah, actually, let me read that section. Now, had Robin Hood been as peaceful as of old, everything might have ended in smoke, as other such ventures have always done before. But he had fought for years under King Richard, and was changed from what he used to be. So I guess that's maybe accounting for the change in tone here, that Robin has come back from King Richard's campaigns. Because yeah, in the previous stories all had a light-hearted tone to them, with Robin Hood as a jokester, but not Robin Hood as the as a fighter. Although Robin Hood got into fights all the time, but he was never leading his men into battle. He was just getting into brawls with people. Anyways, it galled his pride to thus flee away before those sent against him, like a chased fox flees from the hounds. So thus it came about at last that Robin Hood and his yeomen met Sir William and the sheriff and their men in the forest, and a bloody fight followed. So this is quite a change in tone from everything that's come before, where Robin Hood and his merry men are just living the life in Sherwood Forest and being idle tricksters and, getting into fist fights with passerbys, but nothing serious. And now there's a bloody fight. So much for the carefree life of the merry men, huh? The first man slain in that fight was the Sheriff of Nottingham, for he fell from his horse with an arrow in his brain, ere half a score of shafts had been sped. Okay, that's also quite a change in tone. Robin has encountered the sheriff many times before this, but Robin's just delighted in tricking the sheriff and then letting him go. The idea that the sheriff now has an arrow through his brain is another big change in tone. Many a better man than the sheriff kissed the sod that day, but at last Sir William Dale being wounded and most of his men slain, he withdrew beaten and left the forest. But scores of good fellows were left behind, stretched out all stiff beneath the sweet green boughs. Oh, okay, so the body count is suddenly going up very high in this book. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting, and even though Prince John is only at the tail end of this book, this kind of story gives an indication that he's earned his place as one of Robin Hood's fiercest opponents, which is, I guess, perhaps why he takes such a prominent place in later movie versions. This Sir William Dale, who led the campaign into Sherwood Forest against Robin Hood, sounds like interesting. I Googled him to see what I could find on him, because a lot of the people in this book, if you Google them, you can find out their whole history. And there wasn't a lot of information on Sir William Dale. I think there was nothing on Wikipedia. There was something on a Robin Hood wiki which talked about him, but I don't believe... I'd be interested in finding out what other Robin Hood stories Sir William Dale has popped up in. But I can't seem to find anything, as far as I can tell, just by searching Google. This is the only source for Sir William Dale, or I don't know what ballad this is being drawn from. But yeah, I mean, sounds like you could easily imagine a whole story, a whole series of battles between Robin Hood's men and Sir William Dale's men. And then Robin Hood dies, and the story of him dying, being poisoned by his cousin at a nunnery, was something I was familiar with before because of the hearing versions of Robin Hood's story when I was a child. And in fact, my first exposure to the story was the Fisher-Price 1984 cassette tape and comic book that was part of their classics series. And in fact, the language here is almost exactly the same. It is very reminiscent of the Fisher-Price book. And the ending especially is exactly the same. I suspect the people at Fisher-Price, well, that Fisher-Price comic book and cassette tape was based off of an earlier comic book published by Marvel during one of Marvel used to have a series of comic books adapting classic books, which is what Fisher-Price used as their base. But yeah, this poem, which was on Robin Hood's tombstone, is something I remember from the Fisher-Price recordings as a child. And we played this tape so many times that it's lodged in my memory. I couldn't recall it perfectly, but once I hear something that's the same, I instantly recognize it. What does it say? The font here is a little bit difficult to read. So here underneath this little stone lies Robert, Earl of Huntington. Near arrive where as he said, oh, you know what? This is a bad decision to try and read this on camera. You can see here that they're using Old English and they're using an Old English type, which I was able to decipher when I read this earlier this week, but I need to look at the words a little bit for them to click. Okay, anyways, I've rambled on enough about this. I've got one more book to get to. And this is The Linguistic Wars by Randy Allen Harris. Now, this book is the story of, well, it's got a couple of stories. As a prelude, it talks about the Chomskyan Revolution. So before Chomsky, there was a model of linguistics called after Bloomfeld, the Bloomfeldian model, which their primary objective was just to catalog and describe languages, but not worry about getting into meaning or trying to explain why they work the way they did. That's an oversimplification, but that'll work for the present. Chomsky came in and completely revolutionized the field. And then, based on Chomsky's innovation, a new generation of linguists, I say generation, they were only like 5 or 10 years younger than Chomsky, but the students who came after Chomsky wanted to push it further and get into more meaning with something that's been called generative semantics. And Chomsky came down on this hard. And the battle between the generative semantics and Chomsky is what's called the Linguistic Wars, and it takes place in the late 60s and early 70s as these younger linguists are pushing against Chomsky and Chomsky is pushing back. I spent a lot of time reading this book this past week. I don't know how many hours, but a lot. And yet my page count is not all that impressive. I got less than 100 pages in terms of page count. Of course, a book like that has a whole section with the notes at the back end. So maybe by the time you add in the footnotes, that would be another 10 pages of endnotes at the end. I've always been a slow reader, so there you go. I've about 10 or 15 pages an hour is about my usual speed anyways. I feel embarrassed saying that on BookTube, because BookTube is full of just ferocious readers. But yeah, I've always been a very slow reader. So that's part of it, but there's also a lot of technical stuff to absorb here, in addition to flipping back and forth at the endnotes. So it did cause me, I had to read very slowly. I had to go back and reread some sentences again. I had to go back and reread some paragraphs again. There was just a lot to absorb here. And I don't think I can really talk about what I've read because there was just so much to absorb. I mostly understood it as I was reading it, but I'm not sure I could say anything about it now, at least in terms of the linguistic side of it. I mostly understood. There were a few sections where I lost the understanding. And the previous Chomsky book I read, Chomsky's Universal Grammar, as I talked about on this channel, that book near the end I completely lost understanding. The last couple chapters I didn't understand it at all. I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to reach a point in this book where I'm not going to be able to understand it at all. But so far I've been hanging with it more or less. There will be like a section or a paragraph here or there where I don't understand it, and then I get a little bit worried. I said, okay, is this a point where I just lose the plot of this book? But then I keep going, and it turns out that those little sections I don't understand don't seem to matter much to the overall story of the book. I mean, it's an interesting book because it's part the history of a personality conflict. And in so doing, it's talking about the combative personality of Noam Chomsky, the combative personality of George Lakoff, who was one of the, generative semantics, or generative semanticisms. What was the adjective for it? One of the advocates of generative semantics. So talking about how their personalities led to this conflict. But then it's also talking about the conflict of what they were actually fighting over. What was the theory of the linguistic models? So when it's getting into the theory, it can be a little bit hard going. But when it's getting into the conflicts between them, that part is easy to understand whether you understand the theory or not. Let me see if I can find some of the better parts here. Yeah, sorry. So, talking about Chomsky has come back after sabbatical. He's been on Berkeley with a sabbatical. The generative semantics during that time have come out with their new theory. And then Chomsky is coming back, and he's doing a series of lectures called Remarks on Nominalizations, which he says are a reply to a grammar book that was published early, but everybody seems to know that they are intended to undermine the basis for the generative semantics. Sorry, I keep stumbling over the adjective there. The generative semanticists. I don't know. And George Lakoff, who was one of the leaders of the generative semantics, is sitting in on Chomsky's lectures, which I guess you can do. Anyone can just sit on anyone else's lectures when you're at the university, and then just arguing with him the whole time. And there are different recollections of what's been going on here. So George Lakoff is saying that Chomsky is fighting dirty and misquoting people. But then there's an interesting little section here. Others remember the lectures a little differently, particularly about the source of aggression. And so these are three different anonymous accounts of people who were in the class talking about the exchanges between George Lakoff and Chomsky. So Lakoff would sit in the back row and say, "Noam, you're wrong. Everything you say is wrong." He just basically made a pest of himself. So imagine that. Noam Chomsky is lecturing and Lakoff is yelling that throughout the whole lecture. Or here's another recollection. The typical scenario at Chomsky's course would be that Chomsky would say something, then Robin Lakoff, that's George Lakoff's wife, who's also a linguist, who was pathologically shy but smart, would whisper into George's ear. Then George would raise his hand in his swarmy pseudo-civil way, make some comment. Or this one here. Lakoff was combative and impolite. He would go to Noam's class and sit at the front of the room. One time Noam said something and George said, "I have been saying the same thing." Noam asked, "Where did you write about it?" And George responded, "I have been lecturing about these things, and if you're interested, you should come to my class." And then the author comments here, I thought this was interesting. The level of gall required for anyone, let alone a junior lecturer, to tell the inventor of the field to attend his classes if he wanted to stay current, goes right off the chutzpah meter. But then he expresses some skepticism about some of these incidents. He said, it could well go right off the accuracy meter as well, though perhaps not. It is not dreadfully out of character, and several people report the same incident. But then he says, there have to be some distortions in a collection of quotation that have Lakoff exclaiming, "Everything you say is wrong" 1 minute, and being swarmy the next, sitting in the back row and at the front of the room, etc. So, those personality conflicts, or the chutzpah or the arrogance or whatever, you don't need to actually be following the linguistic argument in minute detail to understand what's going on there. So I'm able to hang on to it for those parts, and that is all quite interesting. The back and forth that they have, and it spills out into the New York Review of Books when there's an exchange of letters between Chomsky and Lakoff, and then there's a New York Times article on it, which I actually was reading this section earlier this afternoon, and Googled this, and you can actually find the New York Times article they're referring to. I'll leave a link down to it in the section down below, talking about the New York Times article from 1972, talking about the dissension among the linguists, which is an indication, well, not an indication, which shows that this had become such a contentious issue that was spilling over into the mainstream media at the time. And so, all of that's interesting. I'm learning a lot by reading this book. Okay, I'm out of time here, so I'm just going to stop the video, and I will catch up with another weekly reading vlog next week.